And then dive right in. Lord, thank you for another week, and we thank you for the Arctic blast. We know that your weather, Lord, you've designed this planet perfectly so that we can live here and thrive. And even in our grumbling, Lord, we thank you for caring for us in those ways. I pray that tonight and in the weeks to come, Lord, we can focus our attention on you. You making the decision to create, which you knew meant you were going to make the decision to incarnate and suffer a cross kind of death. And so we pray, Lord, that this Christmas season we would meditate on that. We would draw closer to you as we think about what that means. And that, Lord, you would give us opportunity at gatherings with family and interactions with unbelievers in our life, Lord, that we can bring that message around, bring the conversation around to that message. So give us those opportunities. Thank you for this class. Thank you for these years we've had together, and we pray for next year, starting January, Lord, that you would bring new people to us, Lord, and we would be good stewards of those that you've entrusted to this group. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Okay. So Eric and Jen, I'm going to give two presentations. It's one presentation, but two distinct presentations tonight. The second one is kind of an experiment, and you guys are going to be guinea pigs again, like you were with the Hollywood one. So this one's nowhere nearly as well thought out as that one.
That's because you're going to do this presentation like another group?
No, well, I might if I get a chance to. It's just something I've been kind of chewing on for a few years now, and something I had an aha moment a few weeks ago, and I started writing down what I was thinking, and I was like, well, this is apologetics, and I was disappointed that the book didn't go deeper into the Christmas side of things. Good book, but it's just, we all talked about that last week, and so that's why I put it in. So, okay. But starting off with the book, it is the last week. There is a follow-up chapter, but it's sort of a recap of the first four. This is the fingerprint evidence. Did Jesus alone match the identity of the Messiah? So, in classical apologetics, in a fashion consistent with classical apologetics, we have to start with the two questions that Norm and Frank ask in the book, I Don't Have a Faith to Be an Atheist. When you're reading the Gospels, when you're reading the epistles, but in this case we're talking about the Gospels, the first question you have to ask is, do we have what, in this case, Matthew and Luke wrote about the birth of Christ? So we've covered that, why the Gospels can be trusted historically. Actually not historically. Do we have what they wrote means what Matthew sat down and wrote and what Luke sat down and wrote. Does our English Bible accurately represent that? Because we don't have the original manuscripts anymore. We haven't, no one knows when they went away. So since we don't have the parchment that these guys wrote on, the question fairly can be asked, well, how do we know this is what they wrote? And so we went through, mostly in the session, I don't have no faith in the atheist sessions, but we've done that peppered throughout. We can trust that what we're reading in English is an accurate translation from accurate Greek manuscripts. And then the simple way of saying it is, if you have errors in manuscripts, so a guy is copying from one to another and he has a spelling error, or a extra sentence gets put in, an extra phrase gets put into a manuscript, and everyone who copies that manuscript after him has that addition that was not in the original, but it only happened over in, say, the Egyptian scriptorium, but not in the Asian and the African and the South African. So because you had people all over the planet literally copying Greek manuscripts in monasteries. So because we have 55,000 manuscripts, that's including the Greek, the Coptic, and the other languages. We have so many manuscripts that we can compare them to one another to get back to what the originals actually said, with a 99.9% accuracy rate, meaning there's 0.1% left that they're not entirely sure. And that's just, I guess, I don't even know how they calculate that, other than say, we want to stay a little bit humble that, okay, maybe we'll find another manuscript later that will bring light to something else. But the small percentage that they aren't 100% sure on, not a single doctrine is at stake. So you're talking about minor details, like, did Jesus wear his Nikes or Adidas that morning, or something like totally trivial. There's nothing on the line in the Christian faith. So yes, we have what they wrote, and in this case, about the Christmas story. This is what Matthew and Luke wrote. But that doesn't mean that it's true, because we would say, yeah, we have an accurate copy of what the Odyssey from Homer. So Homer wrote a book called a story called the Odyssey, and we think that pretty accurately we've got the translations that we read in English are what Homer wrote, but nobody thinks that Medusa actually exists, or that the Zeus is up there doing his stuff, and the Trojan Wars actually happened, even though we talked a couple weeks ago that the city of Troy was discovered. Remember that whole quest? There was an 1800s archaeologist who wanted to prove that the Odyssey was historical. And so he went around looking for artifacts, and because he was motivated by that, he went and looked, and he found the city of Troy. Okay, it was an historical city that we didn't know about until then. So we were trying to make the point that someone can have good motives or bad motives, misguided motives, doesn't matter. The question of historicity can be asked regardless of somebody's motives. So in that case, we were trying to say that Christians shouldn't be kept out of historical and archaeological fields just because we're motivated by trying to prove the Bible correct. That's nothing wrong with what your motives are. Just do good science, good archaeology. But even with Troy being real, even with accurate manuscripts, nobody argues that, maybe except for maybe that guy, that the Odyssey actually happened. Because that's a secondary question, which is what they wrote about that first Christmas actually true? Did it happen? Who cares that way? Well, I mean, it's somewhat important that we have what they wrote, but we think probably that the Quran is probably accurate to what Muhammad and his people put together, because I think it's pretty sure that he didn't write it, at least in its entirety. We think we have the Book of Mormon accurately copied. Of course, that's from English to English, so it's even easier. So we can look at false religions that we totally disagree with and say, yeah, your scriptures are accurate to what your founder wrote, but we don't think that means anything. The second question is what really matters most. Did it actually happen? Did was a baby born, and more importantly, was a baby born that was sinless, that was the second person of the Godhead? And there's theology you have to do to answer that question. There's, of course, archaeology and history that we're going to talk a lot about tonight. There's prophecy prior to Christ's birth, what was prophesied about him. A lot of things go into the question of is what they wrote actually true. Of course, the Frank Turek's famous thing, he holds up a Bible and he says, this cannot be the Word of God if there's no God. So the first question is, does God exist? That matters prior to even asking, is this God's Word or is that God's Word? Is there a God to begin with? And then what kind of God is he? Is he able to communicate with his creatures? Because there are some philosophies that would say God exists. It's called deism usually, but he's unable to communicate with his creation because he's so much higher. He's transcendent, so he can't come down to talk in our language and enter time the way that God did even prior to Christ. He was entering time to interact with us. So these questions have to be answered first, which we're not going to do tonight. Save that for January on. But is what they wrote about Christmas true? There's a lot that is packed into that question, more than just theology. So I'm going to go through, I put on down here, you can't see it because I didn't want it to be so bright, but I don't want to take credit for this organizing of these scriptures. So if you're interested, when Al posts the presentation, you'll see it on there. It's from Josh McDowell's website, josh.org. Handy, because he did the most work compiling it in his book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. It's like an encyclopedia, basically. You go from issue to issue, and he's got a whole section in there. Incidentally, the second edition of that, SES actually wrote it. He hired us I wasn't there yet, but to compile mass amounts of that book, the second one. And so we feel pretty proud of that. But, yeah, it's a good book. We worked hard on that, they say. But if you want to find out more, go there. Josh didn't write this article, but it's taking his word, and it's just asking the question, did the prophecies, what prophecies were made, and did he fulfill them? The most important ones that we're going to look at tonight, number one, they're most important because they have to do with Christmas, and the other prophecies don't. So even the great prophecy about his hands were pierced and his feet, that's awesome because crucifixion hadn't even been invented yet. That's an amazing prophecy that's just it's difficult for a materialist or naturalist to explain away. But it doesn't have anything to do with Christmas, so we're not going to focus on that tonight. I'll show you the slides and just know that when Al puts them up, so you don't have to worry about writing down all the references. If you want the full list of prophecies that was on this website, then you'll have it. But the important thing is, from an apologetic perspective, say Jesus grew up and started thinking of himself as the Messiah. And he was a Jewish boy, so he was studying in Jewish schools what they were teaching about the Messiah. There are certain things that he could start to do in his life to fit the role, so to speak. All right, we're all thinking this is about crucifixion here. Romans clearly are crucifying a bunch of people. All right, I gotta get executed that way. That's my goal. He could feasibly try to do that if he was a fraud, right? There are several things, though, that were predicted about the Messiah that had to do with his birth in his early years, which he could not have controlled. You can't control where you're born. So, and the circumstances surrounding your birth. So not only is it Christmassy and fun for our purposes, but the apologetic value here is, well, what do you think Jesus, he manipulated in the womb where his mom had to go? And I thought about this too. You know, there's a lot said about the census by skeptics, and they say, you know, the census, if this thing happened, why in the world is there no record of it? We looked at, there actually is record of a census like that happening. But think about this, the first generation that received the Gospels, these are people who were all in the Roman Empire, even the mostly non-Jewish church, but the Jewish church, of course. Everyone who was reading the Gospel of Luke and Matthew, they were in the Roman Empire, and if they read an account of a census taking place, and there weren't any censuses taking place around that time or even at all, Christianity would have been, you know, maybe not defeated, but it would have been diminished in people's eyes right away in the first century. In other words, the people who had the ability to say, no, that's false historically, had no problem whatsoever with the gospel accounts, any of the gospel accounts. Nobody claimed non-historicity until after the Enlightenment, so in the last couple hundred years. I think that's kind of curious that, well, if the original readers in the original context said no problem, who are you to go back 1800 years later and say, oh, here's a non-historical statement? Because it's not like we just wrote it and it's not historical. They wrote it back then while these people were still alive. It just struck me in preparing for tonight, and I thought that was worth saying. So, okay, right away in Genesis 3:15. Now, the interesting thing about Genesis 3:15, you know how the gospel writers will say, and Jesus did this to fulfill the prophecy that was spoken about him. There are a lot of prophecies that the gospel writers didn't, you know, explicitly say. Like, he was bruised wounded for our transgressions, bruised for our iniquities. I don't think the gospel writers ever use that, do they? Did Paul? Wow, this is bad. I'm showing. Let's take that off the tape. I don't think that was ever quoted by New Testament writers. I'll have to go back and look at it. But the Gospels didn't, I'm almost certain of that. But there are a lot of prophecies about the Messiah in the Old Testament, and a fraction of them are actually cited in the New Testament. But the cool thing about when the New Testament cites it, who inspired the Old Testament? Not the human author, but the author, two authors, the human and God, right? In every instance of an inspired scripture, you have two authors. Who inspired the New Testament? God. So the author has the right to clarify something that he wrote before. So if in the New Testament, whether it's in an epistle or in the Gospels, if God inspired the writer to say, here's what I meant when I said that, you know, the Messiah would be born in the city of David. I meant Bethlehem. That's what I meant. He has the right to do that, to give clarity to Old Testament passages. That's showing that looking back on Old Testament prophecies is legitimate, because we know for a fact that God said that's what I meant. Genesis 3:15 is one of those examples that it's not cited in the New Testament. I know that. And there's debate. Jewish apologists especially really fight this one, that this isn't a messianic prophecy at all. This is just saying that according to that. Well, let's just read it. And I will put enmity. This is God cursing the serpent. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. So the liberal theologians, Old Testament scholars, and Jewish apologists will say this has nothing to do with a messianic prediction. This is just saying that the human race is going to be struggling with nature, specifically the serpent, snakes, forever. And yeah, we do. We get bit by a cobra, we get bit by a copperhead, and then it's bad for us. That's all it means. What would you say to that? Right, you can say no. The answer is no. The number one, this is a pivotal, seminal point in human history. Obviously, going from paradise to a creation that we are no longer immortal. We will die, and our relationship with nature is messed up now. The curse and relationship with each other, it's all messed up. This is huge. Out of all the animals that we have enmity with, I mean, the snakes, sure, but I think humans have been eaten more by things like lions and bears, and sharks if they live in the ocean. I mean, how many snake deaths versus other animal deaths are there? Why would it matter if it was just trying to make some point about animals that were going to be harming us as humans? So it seems just out of place in the context of the gravity of this scene that's playing out to say that it's just something as simple as that. And he will crush your head. It's not they. There's a he that he's talking about. And then the major question of any prophecy is, well, who else fulfills that? What other figure can you point to in the Old Testament that you could say he crushed Satan's head and serpent struck his heel? So those are just at first glance the answers to why this looks like it clearly is a prophecy, that God is promising some correction to what just happened. That's the other context. I'm kicking you guys out, I'm cursing everybody, but I'm giving you hope here. I'm giving you a promise that it's going to get better. Isaiah 7:14. This is the one that is quoted in the Gospel of Matthew. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel. It's quoted in Matthew 1:23. It's also quoted by Linus. Is it Linus? The lights go down, and he starts reading out of Isaiah. This is one of them. I'm doing a puzzle right now, the Charlie Brown Christmas. I love it. That's a great show. It's boring and slow moving, but it's so inspiring, just the simplicity of it. So the debate that is centered around here that he talked about in the chapter is that the word virgin in Hebrew, the claim by the critical scholars, is that Hebrew word does not just mean that has not slept with a man, so therefore a virgin. It could mean other things. And he has a good explanation in there as to, no, actually, if that was what Isaiah was trying to say, here's this other Hebrew word that was perfect for that. This word here is definitely meaning a virgin the way we mean it today. And then, more importantly, how is if you just mean a young woman, is what they say, that the word virgin, translated here, virgin, means young woman. A young woman conceives and gives birth. That happens all the time.
And why would she call him Emmanuel and that be right?
Yeah, exactly. God with us. Two things that are triggers that you're trying to read in context. How is somebody having a woman having a baby, a young woman having a baby, a sign for anything? How would you know? Of the millions of babies that are born every year, which one is the sign supposed to be? And then, Emmanuel, God with us. Now, I've heard some say that, well, Emmanuel means like, okay, God's on our side. So David, was a sort of Emmanuel because God was with him. God was with Israel, clearly, because he kept winning battles. So that's what you'll hear. So the point will be, okay, that's a stretch, given the full, prophecy.
Of course, there's still people that name their kids Emmanuel today, and
Right, and Jesus
And
has.
Jesus, yeah.
So, a lot of the times, I have found that when somebody brings up an objection like that, well, Emmanuel just means God with us, or that expression that Thomas says when Jesus shows him his hands and feet, he says, "My Lord and my God," and everyone's like, well, people say, "Oh my God," all the time, OMG, that's all that was. And you first you're like, oh, what do I say to that? Because that sounds plausible. But then you think back, and a Jew who grew up reciting, "There is no God," or "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. Yahweh is one. There is one God." A person who that was grilled into their entire life is not going to make that mistake and say, "My God." Not to mention you're not supposed to take the Lord's name in vain. So if that was an exclamation, yeah, he was a very bad Jewish boy, if that's the case. Same kind of thing here. I think that God with us. It's a stretch to take that skeptical position. It's a more natural reading, taking the conservative. Yeah, this is a prophecy about God coming into our midst. We're not going to claim this means that a Jew reading this would have read it as God becoming incarnate, taking on a second nature. And we've said this before, but Jesus never chastises anybody for not understanding the Trinity in Old Testament scriptures. He chastises them for not understanding the Messiah would have to be born this way. He would have to suffer and die. You should have known that because of the scriptures. But he never says, "Oh, and you should have known about the triune God." I always found that very interesting, that Trinitarian theology, God had to reveal to us. And we look back on some passages like Emmanuel, and God says, let us make the man in our image. We look at that and, okay, that makes sense if you have three persons in the Godhead. But it's not clear in the Old Testament until you have the New Testament to look back. So this is one of those examples.
So Eric, if you go back one slide. So through the magic of the internet and Jennifer's ability to sleuth in Wikipedia, the most trusted source of information.
Trusted name and news.
So on this verse here, Wikipedia, the article around it, this is called the Proto-Evangelium. That's the name for this verse. So proto meaning first, and then gospel, so the first gospel. So it says here that several of the early church fathers, such as Justin Martyr, that's 160 AD, and Irenaeus, 180 AD, regarded this verse as the first messianic prophecy. So already in the first understudies under John, and I'm trying to remember who Justin might have been under that group as well.
Yeah,
as disciples of
not Papyrus, but the guy who studied under
Polycarp.
Was it Polycarp?
Well, Polycarp
studied under John.
was under John.
And then John tutored one of those two guys.
Yeah, so that's pretty early, right?
Yeah,
To
these are the patristics.
already
This
to
is-
just point right back to this and say
Mhm.
that. So that means even before then, it was probably spinning in the Christian circles in the early church.
Yeah, definitely Christians look back and saw this. The question was, well, the skeptics will come and say, how is it that Christians can go and read that back, even if it was 2nd century? They're still going to claim that, well, that's just you trying to Christianize the Jewish religion. But the things that we just said there, it's who's twisting it more? I mean, this makes more sense because who is he? And everything I just said there. But yeah, that's Irenaeus and Justin Martyr. Those are the two. Yeah, we're gonna have a quote later on from, I think it was Irenaeus. Actually.
Well, I call him Irenaeus.
Yeah, no, I get in the habit of that, but it's Irenaeus. So yeah, we'll quote him later too, because it's neat to see some things. It's something comforting about a practice that we have or a belief that dates right back to the very first generation after the apostles. And you're like, okay, this is not like some fringe thing that's just American version of Christianity. This is as pure as it gets. Things are not correct because the patristics, we call them the patristics, the church fathers. That 2nd century is called the patristic period. Just because they said something doesn't mean it's right. Because I read some things that they've written that were kind of weird. They were a little mystical for my blood at times, but they also were. Anyway, we'll say that. I'll leave it there. In Jeremiah, he's the fact of Jesus' birth was prophesied in those two. This is how he breaks it up in the article. The fact of it, the nativity years. Jeremiah 31:22. How long will you wander, unfaithful daughter Israel? The Lord will create a new thing on earth. The woman will return to the man. Now that one, as I reflected on it, I thought, okay, that's not as obvious as some of the other ones, like Bethlehem being named. But one thing, I again, just like we said with the Emmanuel, like who is he talking about then? Where you could say God is truly with us. I would say here, what does it mean that the Lord will create a new thing on earth? That's a pretty big deal, because we know, a Jew would read that and say, well, he's not creating anything new. He's in the Sabbath day of his rest. Nothing new is being created. So it would grab the attention of a Jewish reader that something more than just someone, because a person being born, just a regular person that doesn't have a divine nature, that's not a new thing being done on the earth, right, that the Lord is working on. So I think that's the trigger for a Jewish reader to say something else is going on here. That's why it's included in this article. And then the phrase, the woman will return to the man. It seems like it's referring back to the garden, that the woman came from man, and then ever since then men have been born of women. It seems to be a reference back to the garden, and the fact that he's saying create a new thing, there's a creation motif there. So it sounds to me like he's hearkening back to that creation story, and maybe back to that original prophecy that we just read about the he will strike his heel, and he will crush your head. By the way, side note, the New Testament says, who's going to crush Satan's head?
He.
Who?
What's it, he?
That's what the Old Testament says.
Oh.
The interesting thing is, now this is menonymically we're doing this, right? This is a metonymy maybe. A little joke for people who are at the conference. It says, Paul says that he, God, will crush Satan under our heels. That we'll get to crush Satan. There's some aspect of this sense we have of injustice, and we want revenge for sins that have been done against us, and probably we want justice for Hitler, let's say, or the sin there. There's a sense that we will get to execute justice.
The church, right?
Yeah, he's definitely, because he says you, that's in an epistle where he's addressed it to the church, and I can't remember which epistle it was in, but
Yeah.
I've always, I heard that one time, this might be taking some license, but that's in there. It says he will crush Satan under your feet. Now obviously you can't point to any time in history where Satan's been crushed under the feet of the church. The church has been victorious to various degrees for a couple thousand years, but I wouldn't say any of those times have been the crushing of Satan's head. So it seems to be an eschatological and end times statement that Paul's making there. A guy named Dan Allender, who wrote with Larry Crabb a lot, he had a book called Bold Love, and he did a speaking circuit on it. I don't think it's in the book, but what he said is that when someone wrongs you, sins against you, and you get back at them, you're trying to bring about justice in the here and now. He says that's not when you're supposed to do that, because that person, they can be redeemed and go to heaven too. The one that you should be mad mostly at is Satan, and don't worry, God's going to crush him under your feet. And so he said, when you take vengeance yourself, you take it on yourself to get the person back, you lose your place in line, because we're all going to line up and get a shot at Satan, at his head. And he says, I don't know about you, but I want that head fresh and crunchy when I get up to it. I want to dig my heel in and say that's for all the things that you caused to happen in this world, all the evil. I thought that's nothing. It's not theology there, but I thought that's kind of a cool picture. The theology is true that God's going to crush Satan, use us.
It's Romans 16:20.
It's Romans, okay.
Yeah, it says, and the God of peace shall bruise Satan under your feet shortly. That's King James.
Yeah, I think crushed is the.
Yeah, and if
other
it
versions will say.
it does. It says in NIV, the God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet.
And you got to think that Paul was not unaware of the Genesis 3 passage as he wrote that. It sounds like he meant for that to be, hey guys, look back there. There's some connection there. Because Paul's certainly not talking about Jesus there. He's addressing us, or the Roman church.
But obviously the work is not done yet, so for anybody that thinks that at that point that the crushing of Satan had been once and done, there's a final event where that's actually
Right,
still
it
happening.
seems to be talking about the end
Future
times, right?
Yeah.
And the way that the King James translated there, will soon, that wouldn't mean like in your lifetime, because that's the way Jesus said, I will be coming soon. It means that quickly or at the end. And maybe at the other side of the end times, we're all going to say, yeah, it was quick. Yeah, that was a snap of a finger in perspective. So that's consistent with what Dan Allender taught. Okay, the place was predicted. Numbers, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star will come out of Jacob. A scepter will rise out of Israel. He will crush the foreheads of Moab, the skulls of the people of Sheth. Now I will say, this is a good opportunity to bring this up. Dual fulfillment, he touched on it in the chapter 4 here. There are prophecies in the Old Testament that have an immediate reference, that this is who the prophet was talking about, and it was fulfilled in that generation or the next generation. There was immediate fulfillment, and then there's an ultimate fulfillment. And we know this because there are some times that the New Testament refers back to a prophecy, but that prophecy was fulfilled, and we can point to where it was fulfilled in the short term in a finite way, whereas the infinite or the ultimate way it was fulfilled was in Jesus or the end of the world. Because Jesus didn't do everything in his first trip, right? He left some stuff for the end. So that's another thing to just be prepared for, is if somebody is going to tell you that, Emmanuel is referring to this political leader of Judah. Maybe it was, but not ultimately. And so in any way that people, just like the sacrificial system of the Old Testament took care of sin for a year, took care of sin, did not ultimately do it until Jesus died and took care of sin once and for all. So we have good ground to stand on and say, yeah, sure, you might be pointing to something, and that may be true, maybe not. We can explore that historically. But it says nothing about whether or not it also was referring and ultimately referring to Jesus. So that's another little, see the Christmas story, all these cool little apologetic tidbits here. Because I actually don't know, I tried to find something, but like Moab and Sheth, I don't know how Jesus specifically fulfilled that portion of the prophecy. People have obviously written on it, probably written dissertations on it, because they've had a lot of time to do that. But I just didn't find it in this week's study. A ruler will come out of Jacob and destroy the survivors of the city. So what it's saying here, though, is that the Messiah is going to be, if you keep saying Jacob, 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 who's the Messiah have to be? Or what race does this Messiah have to be? Jewish. Right. So that's all he's saying here is Jacob. And remember later on it talks about a son of David and the house of, so it gets real specific. In Micah 5:2, but you, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, sounds like a lisp. Though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from ancient times. Okay, so a couple things that are interesting here. Number one, what we studied already about, Bethlehem was a hick town. It made some of the outskirts of Charlotte towns look like metropolis. Remember that, I think they said about 500 people, maybe, at the time of Jesus' birth. So it was not a huge place. And that makes sense because he's saying, but you, Bethlehem, though you're this insignificant town, you get the honor of being the place where the Messiah is going to be born. So who else was born in Bethlehem? Famous guy.
John the Baptist? No.
Well, probably not, because Mary had to travel to visit. Well, she wasn't from Bethlehem anyway at the time. They went to Bethlehem. King David.
You're going back older.
Yeah. The city of David. It was called that because that's where he was born. So they had a famous person that was from there. But Micah was written after the reign of David, after the split of North and South. So obviously he wasn't referring to David. The only other famous person to have come from, it's like Lubbock, Texas. I mean, Billy Howie, was it? No, not Billy Howie. Johnny B. Good. Who's that guy? The singer. You guys, you know Johnny B. Good.
Who's it?
Anyway, some famous 50s singer comes from Lubbock, Texas, and that's it. That's all the town is known for, from what I've been told, by people from Lubbock.
Chuck Berry?
that it?
I don't know, that's John
Buddy
Good.
Holly?
Buddy,
Holly?
yeah, it's Buddy Holly.
Oh.
Yeah, that's right.
So did anybody interpret this, do you think back then, that whose origins are from old, that they would have thought maybe David is coming back, like God is bringing David back somehow to rule? Like, were they really, do you think at the time they appreciated it was going to be God in the flesh? Probably not. It was
Probably not.
looking for this sort of political leader to come on stage.
Yeah.
But I wonder, Elijah, who would they have thought that this would have been from ancient times?
Probably not Elijah, because I don't think there's any connection with him in Bethlehem. But yeah, you're right. Because even son of David, he was called that, which means I come from this line. The Messiah has to come from this line. And absolutely, they were expecting a king, physical king, but with some sort of supernatural bend to him. They were not expecting God incarnate. That's clear.
And today in Bethlehem, there's a place called Manger Square, where people get together every Christmas Eve and they have a Christmas, and it's just amazing that this was prophesied 2,200 years ago.
Yeah,
No,
a little
more than
more,
that,
yeah.
2,800 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And boom, we're still celebrating it today.
And do you guys know that Bethlehem is in the Palestinian side after they gave that land? And my boss was there last year, I think it was his last trip, and he said the difference between when the Jews were ruling it and the Muslims were ruling it is night and day. He said the guy who was giving us the tour of the cathedral of the I forget what it's called, it's a Catholic church.
Scepter, something.
Some high sounding name, but it's where Jesus, they think he was born. So they built a church over it. And so this Muslim tour guide was giving the tour, and Dr. Land, we were just talking about it yesterday, he said he looked like he would have enjoyed nothing more than to rip our hearts out of our chest. He just had this look at it like, I can't kill you because my job description says I can't. But you Christians and you Jews, and just this, he said, but back up when the Jews were in charge, they let pretty much religious freedom, that Christians could go and have pilgrimages to Bethlehem without any harassment. So anyway, that's a little side note there. But in Psalm 72, may the kings of Tarshish and of distant shores bring tribute to him. May the kings of Sheba and Seba present him gifts. Now Sheba, we know, was mentioned, the Queen of Sheba had interactions with Solomon, right? I looked up Sheba and Seba, and there's not debate, but they're not exactly sure where those places would be. But the point here is that from distant shores, lands far away, the rulers are going to give tribute to this king or this ruler. Okay, so a side note here, which I think is pretty cool. Last year, I think it was Brian that brought this up. Who were these guys? We don't know if it was three of them, by the way, right? We know at least there were two, because it's in the plural, and there were three gifts, but it never says there were three rulers. So two or more of these scholars, they were, some people call them astrologers, but they at the very least studied the stars. They studied not just the stars, because the stars don't tell the people where Bethlehem is or what Bethlehem is or anything like that. Stars give them certain signs, but they studied something, which was what? The Jewish scriptures. Now, how did these non-Jews, because Jews didn't get out and evangelize much. They keep to themselves, don't kill us, we're just going to obey the law when they're being good, or we're going to absorb your religion. But they didn't do a lot of evangelizing. So how would it be that these kings, these rulers, knew anything? And the answer is the Babylonian exile. That these were rulers probably coming from Babylon. So Daniel, and all that he and those guys did, remember they rose up far to the point where they were let go and given tribute, or given, here, you guys go and rebuild your city. It's pretty cool seeing God's hands. Kind of like when the Jews got taken away to be slaves in Egypt, and he didn't rescue them right away, and you look back and it says, well, the reason he didn't rescue them right away is because when he rescued them and brought them to the promised land, he was going to command them, wipe out everything. But the Canaanites who lived there immediately following the descent to Egypt were not totally wicked yet. there was still a glimmer of hope amongst them. And it says in the scripture, I waited 430 years, I think it was, because the sins and the wickedness of the Canaanites had not yet reached its full potential. So God's willing to wait or let his people suffer, and sometimes we know to allow his plan to play out. And here's another example of it. What happened in
It's kind of like Madonna, you know, she took on the Jewish, you know, mysticism, the Kabbalah, was it? Something like
Yeah,
that?
it's-
And these are the Zoroastrians, I think is who they were, right? That was their.
Probably
that-
something like
that,
to it, yeah.
this Eastern, Far East mysticism mixed with, like you say, the scripture. So maybe there's hope for Madonna that she doesn't realize it, but
There's always hope,
Kanye
right?
West.
There you go.
Yeah, she's from, she went to a high school that I used to play in football. She's from Rochester,
Really?
Michigan, yep. She never has anything nice to say about our home state though. So we all don't like her. So anyway, that's, the interesting thing is to look back. Do you guys remember when Brian brought that up, from the archaeology talk he did last year? It's just cool to see. The book of Daniel has just come alive to me in the last 5 to 6 years, because I mean it is, depending on Hebrew prophecy, right? But it's specific about who the rulers are going to be. I mean, it practically names them and gives dates. Even if you don't take the 77 motif, he clearly is talking about 4 rulers that fit Alexander the Great right down, you know, then kingdoms like the Persian, the Greeks, the Romans, and then something else. I just think it's cool that it's so specific that skeptics, critical scholars have dated the book of Daniel. There's no way it was written during the Babylonian exile, because Persia was just starting to rise up and to take over. So he may have been able to see the tides and said, okay, well, Persia's the first kingdom. But there was no inkling of Greece and Rome rising up when Daniel was written. So the skeptics will say there's no way it was written as early as you guys say it was written. It was written, they would say, even after Christ. But then, lo and behold, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we find the book of Daniel in its entirety in their library. So obviously it was before Christ, and it must have been well established by that time to be included in their library along with Isaiah. So a little side note that I think is pretty cool about the book of Daniel. Yeah. Nations, this is still we're talking about the Magi. Nations will come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn. Okay, that's the end of the ones I'm going to actually quote. The rest of these have to do with his life after his birth. But any questions or comments about that?
Do you think that there has been any scientific studies, I'm sure there has, around what the Magi were following to get to the Christmas child, right?
There's been a lot written on that.
You know,
yeah.
there's a comet maybe that we've been able to backtrace, you know, to that time frame, and that was always in the sky there. Is it just speculation?
It's
or
all
is-
speculation.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, Hugh Ross has his theory. Maybe any of these possible, but here's the thing: we don't have to come up with some chemical explanation of how the water was turned to wine. It's a miracle, right? There's no way you could say, well, here's the chemical process by which. I mean, water is not the type of thing to ferment in the first place, right? So this is a change. This is God doing a miracle. Same thing with the sun and the moon stopping in the sky in Joshua. Ross will point out rightly that if the Earth were, because we're spinning at a little over 1,000 miles an hour, and so if the Earth were to stop, the whole outer crust of the Earth would just keep going, and the whole Earth would be wiped out. And so he says it's probably some other celestial thing happening where it wasn't the sun and the moon, but some sort of northern lights type of a phenomenon. But again, maybe, but there's no need to invoke those kinds of explanations. A miracle is a miracle. God can certainly attend to all the details necessary to pull off a miracle. He made everything, right? So he could do that. So like with this, the star, it's interesting stuff, but it could just be literally God put a light in the sky that wasn't a star millions of light years away. It's just a light he used to get their attention.
God was just wearing one of those headlamps.
Yeah, on his physical body,
Yeah,
and
right.
he and his wings and his headlamps. Could have been an angel, could have been, yeah, a lot of different things that are available to God. The only thing God can't do is violate himself, right? He can't lie, he can't make himself not exist, he can't take away existence from us. That's why we have to go to either heaven or hell, because he's given us this good thing called existence. It's against his nature to remove that. So any explanation you want to come up with for these miracles, fine. Just don't violate who he is, but also don't put too much stock into it either, because our faith doesn't rise or fall based on what that was in the sky that night. And so while it's interesting, it's irrelevant. His mission in his office, his mission is probably he was a prophet like Moses. They predicted that the Messiah's ministry would convert the Gentiles, that he would come from Galilee. Now the interesting thing here is, so it predicts his birth in Bethlehem, but his ministry someplace else. This is getting more and more difficult to fake it. The preaching, and also again, to use some, I always hear the voice of the critics in my head because I studied under them at Eastern Michigan, and I heard all the garbage, and so their voice is always in the back of my head. Well, what about this? What about that? So the Bible just filled in the blanks. It's like one of those Mad Lib things where you just fill in, and that became the Gospels. But remember, the Gospels were written when a lot of the people were still alive that know Mary and Joseph's family. They knew Jesus. They lived in Jerusalem, so they could verify. And in one part, you remember what Paul says. Yeah, and there are people who were there who are still alive. Go ask them if you don't believe me. Paul puts it on the line to say, yeah, fine, go check it out. We're telling you the truth. If he wasn't born in Bethlehem and if he wasn't from Galilee, the people in those towns would know it. No, there was no census that year. No, there was no execution of our firstborn. None of that stuff happened. But there's no record of that, even by Christianity's critics and enemies, of that kind of stuff, that attack being leveled. Because Christianity was being attacked, trying to be torn down. So it wasn't like it sat peacefully it was the opposite. It was very, very disruptive, and then it became peaceful after the conversion of the emperor. The Messiah is going to be rejected by both Jews and Gentiles. He'll be persecuted. He'll have a triumphal entry. Now Jesus could have faked that one, right? Could have said, I need to get a donkey. I need to ride in on the Passover. So that one he could fake. Betrayal by a friend, unless he paid his friend, and by the way, hang yourself and all that, because that's what's prophesied. False accusations against him, that he was silent under his accusation, and he was mocked. These are all things. His resurrection. Now, if you're just a man, even if you predicted that, how do you work that one out? You can get yourself crucified. That's not that difficult to do in that time, right? But his resurrection and his ascension, good luck, mere human, trying to get that pulled off. His second advent and his universal everlasting dominion. So the Old Testament has a lot to say about the Messiah. Any questions? I was going to do this, but I didn't have any time, but get a very out of focus picture of the baby in the manger, and then every slide get a little bit more, because it gets to a point where it's more unreasonable to deny that Jesus fulfilled prophecies than it is to believe it. Like, again, that image I have of atheists are in a room, the door's over there, and they're painting the floor, but they're painting themselves into a corner, and they just don't have anywhere to go. Eventually, you're just going to have to cry uncle and say, all right, it's true, but I don't want to accept it.
I don't remember who, but somebody calculated the odds, and it was like 1 to 1 with like a gazillion zeros, the probability of all of these stringing together.
Yeah, he has that in here.
Shows you how well I read that.
Just some of them. You read so much, it's hard to remember, where it's so much. I won't bring it up, but yeah, it's huge. The article that I cite that you guys can check out also does that, and it kind of spells it out, and the probability of just these 8 or the ones he doesn't have control over. It's just, there are more, let's see, the odds, there aren't even that many atoms in the universe. That's how crazy it is. You've heard the analogy of coins. You get a bunch of quarters, You mark one of them, and I can't remember how many trillions it is. Like if you were to cover the state of Texas up, I think it was it a mile high, or it was ridiculous. And mix it all up, and go and just on your first try pull out the one coin that was marked. That's what we're talking about probability-wise. It's crazy. Okay, so now this is why I was playing the music. Jenny rolls her eyes at me, my Jenny, not that Jenny, all the time because I get really sentimental about things. I'm old-fashioned in a lot of different ways, and yet I'm the one that likes electronic dance music and stuff like that. So, yeah, imagine that. She's more contemporary or less contemporary in music, more contemporary in other things. But I love the Christmas season. I always have, and not just celebrating the birth of Christ, but everything about it. Families coming together, the singing, the Christmas carols. It stinks that we don't do caroling anymore, door to door. But I guess we don't want to get shot by people who don't, the atheists next door. Kind of thing. But you remember all that, right? All the Christmas caroling. It was fun. It was just warm times. And my favorite movies are, White Christmas and especially those that have to do with the Christmas season or returning home. So I thought of an analogy that what is it that I am enamored with was my first question. What is it? It's not just that Christmas happens, Jesus was born, that's cool. Obviously, I would be going to hell if he didn't, so it's really cool. I'm talking about my experience year after year, because God made us to be cyclical people. He set up the calendar, because you have to keep being reminded, even weekly, to rest, and yearly reminder of all these things. The Jews had annual reminders. They had every 7-year reminders of the Sabbath year to rest the land, for example, every 70 years, the year of Jubilee. So, it's 40 years. We're meant to be that way. We're designed to be not religious, but what's the word I'm looking for? Traditionalist is one word. But so here's the thing: we all know that Christmas has slipped in our culture. Number one, because fewer people believe than used to, and even those of us who do aren't doing the same things each Christmas. And maybe because we're super defensive about, can we say Merry Christmas? We're not at Walmart, so that's what's at stake. We've been distracted a lot, and it's been watered down a lot. But it wasn't satisfying for me for a long time. That can't just be the explanation. So here's an analogy. So communism, Marxism, was a system that was invented. Karl Marx sat down and said, here's the way I think things should be. And from scratch, he wrote out what the communist state should look like. And the journey from here to communism, it was all spelled out. Totally false, didn't match up to reality, and it's murdered 100 million people. So it was a failed experiment, but it was his experiment. But American free enterprise, as in contrast, nobody sat down, founding fathers did not sit down and invent free enterprise capitalism. They didn't. All they did was stay out of the way. Just get your hands off it, don't force people, don't mandate, just give people as much freedom as you can without violating or endangering others. And that's basically their stance. Capitalism is the economic system that looks back on something that's working and says, how's it working? Why is it working so well? Why are so many people rich and wealthy, and even the poor are comfortable in America in comparison to the middle class in other countries? And when they look back on what worked, what they spell out is American free enterprise system. It's not. So my analogy here is that Christians in the West didn't sit down and invent Christmas. I'm talking about not just the story of Christmas, but the practices. Like, well, we really need a tree. We really got to have a tree in it. We really need to have goodwill toward men. So let's come up with ideas to try and make this tradition something meaningful. It was just like capitalism was people living out their beliefs economically. Christmas traditions that I love and that we love so much weren't invented. Just living out our faith, these things came along, and the ones that meant the most stayed, and those are called the Christmas traditions, right down to the songs and the symbols that we all have a pretty good handle on. they were the results of people who valued family, they valued community, they valued the idea that to know that they were loved by God meant everything to them. And so songs like, Silent Night, or the God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen, Christ our Savior is born in Bethlehem, these meant something to them because of their faith, not because of the meaning, the coolness of the songs. Okay. We've obviously lost that. Christmas now is about other things. One of my favorite Christmas movies is Polar Express. Without reading the whole thing, the gist of the story is the magic of Christmas has been lost, and we've got to hang on to it still, got to rediscover it. But what they mean, what the writer means by the magic of Christmas is children, having imagination and dreams that come true, getting the toys that they want. The problem with that is that in a society where, if kids want toys, they just go buy them themselves, or they get their uncle or their aunt or their grandma to buy it for them. It's like getting toys is not that special anymore. That can't be what Christmas is all about. I'm talking even from their perspective. But I do think that they're onto something, because believing in something that's real matters. They're trying to make this belief in Santa and in Christmas gifts and all of that what is real. But we don't want to tell them, no, you're just wrong to want to believe in something real. We can use that to say, no, you're right to want that. What is it that caused Santa? By the way, did you know that Santa Claus is a real person, and you can go through all that? We told the kids, and I don't have any problem with Christian families saying that Santa Claus exists. I'm not a legalist. But we decided, no, when they ask, we'll say, yeah, he existed. And let me tell you the story, man. He was awesome. He was really cool. And every year, because of awesome things that he did to care for the poor children in his community, we do this every year to honor that, because it was cool that he did it. So it's kind of like saying yes and no. No, he's not, the fat guy that comes down the chimney and all that. But I don't even have a problem with that imagery. It's not like it's bad. If you look, Here Comes Santa Claus, the original lyrics. So let's thank the Lord up above, for Santa Claus comes tonight. Originally Christians, as they were having fun with all this stuff, didn't see that this was like either secular or religious practice. It was all one thing. The things that we do to celebrate Christmas. The other one, the movie was kind of dumb. I thought the Grinch. I'm talking about the Jim Carrey one. I was hoping for more, but did you see they're making a movie for Green Eggs and Ham?
I've seen the Netflix one that just came out. It's a Netflix sort of mini movie, but it's like a mini show.
Yeah, that's the one I'm talking about.
Yeah.
For Green Eggs and Ham, though.
Yeah, it was interesting. They combine in the middle the reading of the story, and then the narrator adds more rhyming and poetic, and creates a whole story around how they got to the table about Green Eggs and Ham. I watched it just the other day. It was kind of entertaining.
Is it?
Yeah.
They're milking it, though, aren't they?
I think there's more in the series. I don't think it's just that one. I think
Oh, really?
It's a whole bunch of Dr. Seuss books.
Okay, but this is the only Green Eggs and Ham one, though.
That's correct.
Yeah. That's why I felt like with this one is they kind of had to just invent a whole bunch of stuff to fill 2 hours. It was fine, but it wasn't my favorite Christmas movie by far. But the song that's in there, "Where Are You Christmas?" I forgot it was from that movie, actually. I love it each year, because that kind of put to words what I was feeling each year around Christmas, where it's like, I love, like I said, I love everything about it, and I want it to, not that I'm chasing feelings, but I want these things to be honored and celebrated by our culture, so that it can sort of be a cleansing once a year. If everybody, or most people, would start to refocus, it's a recalibration of our culture. But the words here that I thought were interesting, she's talking to Christmas here. Does that mean that Christmas changes too, just because we grow up? Well, if it just means toys, then yeah, it does. You grow out of it. But she's personifying Christmas. Do you remember the one you used to know? I'm not the same one. See what time has done. Is that why you've let me go? I think what they're doing is they're reaching out to God, and they're saying there's something real there. When Christians behave Christianly, not perfect, even non-believers are blessed. when Christians behave like God wants us to. And that's evident in the capitalism example. It wasn't just Christians that got more money. If you had a Christian baker who was not, or a butcher who wasn't putting, kidney of a horse and liver of a cat, Les Miserables reference, in his sausage, and then you had a Christian one who was putting actual beef and pork in there, and you could trust that it wasn't rotten, and you would start buying from that butcher. Well, this non-Christian butcher, if he wants to stay in business, he better up his game. That's what happened in the West. In the Protestant West, Christians were living out their faith in their vocations, and everyone was blessed for it. So that's why I like it that they're asking these questions. So Christmas, she's personifying Christmas, but you're onto something here. There's something that you used to more willingly believe that you no longer believe. And I think we always knew, even as kids, I never believed in Santa because my older sister ruined it for me as soon as I was old enough to know anything. And I spent the rest of my childhood trying to catch mom and dad, and we never did. They just knew how to put us to sleep. Maybe it was that pill they gave us for Christmas Eve.
Melatonin.
Here, you have a cold. Yes, you do.
Benadryl. You're allergic.
So, anyway, I've never struggled with believing Santa Claus was let down or anything like that. But the point is that that can't be all that there is. Okay, a little history. If you've been in the I don't have enough faith, and the rest of you who will be in January, I go through a timeline of what happened in America. Christianity, Protestant evangelical Christianity in America was very intellectual, very smart. They were well read. They studied all sorts of subjects, and in order to earn the right to study theology. So, pastor in a community, you could go ask him about political theory, history, correct your English paper, whatever, because this guy, he had studied. We went from that to anti-intellectualism, this journey to being well-read and studied is almost a hindrance to being passionate about God. And we go through all the reasons why and what the consequences were. But the Puritans were the ones, that group that came over here, that it was in either them directly or the tradition that came from them, that was this really intellectual, very solid theologically group of Christians. But they weren't all good. They had a lot of things that were bad, like anybody, right? But the singing of Christmas songs, actually, I found this out, goes back to the patristic period as well. First Christmas carols we know of back in 129 AD, a bishop in Rome made a decree that we have a copy of, that he called this, it was called Angel's Hymn, and the decree was that it would be sung at Christmas services every year in Rome. So it's the first one that we know that this is a Christmas carol we're going to sing. Oh, by the way, do you guys know what the 12 days of Christmas are? Not the symbols, but what 12? What's the importance of 12? I did not know this. You know how Orthodox Christianity celebrates in January, and Latin Christianity, Protestant Christianity, Catholic, we do it December 25th. It's 12 days in between. January 2nd or 3rd or whatever. But that's called the 12 days of Christmas, is when you bridge those two. And I don't know what the significance of bridging them was, because they didn't like the East. So Oliver Cromwell was a Puritan leader, and you remember in England, it's true today, there is no separation of church and state. So he was a political leader and a church leader. And from the Enlightenment, he was concerned about people acting immorally. And that's legitimate, right? That people are getting drunk all the time. And, okay, so England's got to clean up its act. Great Britain's got to clean up. And that was his conviction. But what he said, he went all the way. What he said was, well, at Christmas time, man, people really just let loose. The non-Christians were getting wasted, but everybody was celebrating. They were singing songs. They were doing Christmas caroling in the streets. They were, and that's what they did. The 12 days of Christmas that's when the Christmas carols were sung, from 25th to the 12 days later. And he thought that was just as bad as getting wasted on alcohol, which I don't understand how he connected those dots, but he did. So he was on a mission to cleanse the nation of its most decadent excesses, and he thought Christmas was one of them. So in 1644, he got an act passed by Parliament which effectively banned the festival. And in June, a few years later, in 1647, the Parliament passed an ordinance confirming the abolition of the Feast of Christmas. So illegal to have Christmas dinner in a Christian nation. That's just stupid and misguided and throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And it's important for us to remember as Christians that what is it that we're trying to say to culture and to the Christian culture of today. You guys know how critical I am of the youth culture, and I don't mean youth, I mean pop Christianity, right? We're just talking about the thin theology, the completely wrong theology sometimes, calling God, a being that you can change his mind by praying to him and stuff like that. So that's really just bad theology. But even things that are wrong, but kind of silly or misguided, I'm really critical of. But I don't want to, I'm not calling for a return to the Puritan days when it was overly intellectual. Because that over-intellectualism created a dead orthodoxy that was like, yeah, I'm a Christian, can't you tell? That's bad too. So it's not so much of let's stop doing all of this stuff, awesome praise and worship and personal testimony and be excitable when we're talking about something God's doing in our life or a way he used us. Keep every bit of that. Add to it, is all I'm saying, a more rich, robust intellectual life. Then we won't make the same mistake that every other generation, which is this like left, right, and there's a great scene in the movie, the Polar Express. Remember when they're on the ice and it starts cracking and they got to get going. And there's just a real thin, narrow canyon, just a little bit wider than the train itself, that they have to get to. The problem is they're on the ice. And the driver can't see because he normally doesn't have to see anything because he's not seeing the track. He just keeps going until he has to stop. So there isn't an easy way for the person in the driver's seat to be left, right, left, right. So you got the conductor up on the front and the driver inside, and he has to just scream out vocal commands. And he's going along and he's saying left, and then because he's on ice, it starts overcorrecting. He's like right, 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 and then it's overcorrecting to the left. And he has to keep doing that back and forth until he's right on the money and they can get in the canyon and not die. That's my imagery of cultural shifts. That in the church we have a habit of going, too far to one side. Men coming home from the war, as an example, and taking Christianity for granted in the Greatest Generation, and raising a generation of children that were told, well, you're going to believe it because I believed it, and just believe it. And they were emotionally distant because of the horrible things they saw in World War II. Well, that created the hippies. The hippies are the children of that generation. And so the hippies created us, the Gen Xers, which we didn't know what we believed in because we said, you guys are freaks. They don't want anything to do with you. No war, here's our cause. So we didn't know what we stood for, right? We're like, yeah, I guess we want to win the Cold War, but, let's go play the arcade games. We did not have, and you look at the movies in the 80s, that's what it was. I mean, people with no ambition ended up making it in life. Just not realistic, but that was the 80s. So my point is, please, let's not do this back and forth as we're saying, let's try to correct the immorality of our culture and the bad celebrations of Christmas, or the ones that people have forgotten their meaning. Let's not overcorrect and crash into the wall. That's my point here. Have yourself a very little Christmas. Okay, the last couple points here. Faithful friends who are dear to us will be near to us once more. Someday soon we all will be together if the fates allow. Until then, we'll have to muddle through somehow. So have yourself a merry little Christmas now. That's not a very compelling goal if community isn't something that's valued. We're a very isolated culture today. We got our own family unit, and if you're lucky, you like each other. But how well do we even know our next door neighbors? let alone the community at large. And we try hard in the church, especially First Baptist here, to create that community. But that used to happen naturally out of necessity, I think, and also people were more aware of and committed to living biblically. And so community was important. And because of that, when they were off to war or had to take a job in another town, they came home for Christmas, it was meaningful to them. But nowadays, who cares if you're home for Christmas? I don't like those people anyway, right? That's sort of the joke in most of the modern Christmas stories is that's the time of year that you have to put up with people who you don't like. That's Christmas. So the point here is community. We need to get back to the business of building community, not so that we can have Christmas be great again, but if we do what we're supposed to do as Christians in community, then the bonus is going to be like the bonus of capitalism, the fruits of capitalism, that good things that people will want to return to will start to be created in our midst. I'll be home for Christmas. If you don't like your family, why does that matter? And that's a punishment if you have your dysfunctional family that everyone's dysfunctional, right? We know that. But we have to work hard to foster a loving home that our children will want to return to someday for holidays. And that is hard, really hard, right? And it takes a whole lot of forgiveness and grace and oops, that didn't work, let's try again, didn't see that one coming, oh, that's ugly, I'm willing to go there with you, son, and just, it's hard work. Loving is messy work, especially in the most important unit, the family. So we have to get back to that business, so that people will actually say, I want to be home for Christmas. Of course, those are war songs, most of those. That's why I think World War II is so romantic to us, is that crystal clear what they were fighting for. There was no ambiguity about it. Well, geez, Hitler, he has a point there. I think, the eradication of a people has its plus sides, right? No one thought that. He was clearly the devil. We had to kill him, and anyone who wanted to follow him, clear as day. So if I have to pull a trigger, I have to pull a trigger. Doesn't mean it wasn't hard to execute it, but it does mean that there was moral clarity. And they had the traditions that they actually valued. But they wanted to not be in the battlefield because they missed their family. So what can we do? Don't be a Scrooge. Okay, I think the things of Christmas, Santa Claus is cool, cookies are cool, trees are cool. Don't be a Scrooge and don't be seen as Christians just don't want to have any fun. Watch Hallmark movies. I mean, Kleenex needs to have customers. And darn it, you start getting it with, although Endgame was a
We heard it in
tearjerker.
church.
Is that just for girls, or guys are supposed to watch them too?
We are under no contractual obligation to
Okay.
join them. But you could.
It's called date night.
Right. But then just, like, okay, then what are you going to watch with me then? That's what I think.
Yeah.
So, I pay a lot of dues in the movie front. I've watched Little Women. I've watched, oh man, I told you guys this, when I was dating Jenny, I wanted to understand her better. On my own, I rented Anne of Green Gables, the miniseries, and I watched it. And the guys in my house that I was living with, one of them actually started kind of walking back and forth while I was watching. It's like, what, 6 hours long? It's long. And he got kind of interested, and eventually he just sat down. He's like, "Who's Gilbert?" I'm like, okay, well, Gilbert's the guy, and so I actually know Anne of Green Gables. I've paid my dues. Foster a strong, Jesus-centered home life. Notice I didn't say perfect, because that is not possible, and if you try, you'll be a Pharisee, and you will be completely unattractive to the world, right? So, Jesus-centered is what I mean. Invest in each other's lives to foster a strong community. It's messy, it's uncomfortable, we will tick each other off, guaranteed, right? The churches I've been involved with have given me reasons to leave. This church has given me reasons that I could cite as, yeah, I'm not going to stick it out. I don't believe in that. I don't believe in leaving just because something happens. It has to be egregious. I mean, the pastor sleeping with secretaries kind of stuff, for me to say I'm done with that community, or God calls me to go someplace else. Physically, I moved from Michigan to down here, so yeah, I had to kind of do church. I couldn't commute. I think that we need to get to that in the church community, and it will spill over into the community. Especially, that's one thing I love about First Baptist. We work so hard to bring the community in. We need to be better about going to the community on their level, I think. But we're really good about, hey, we got awesome Christmas show. We've got trunk or treat. We write the cards. You come into the neighborhood, you move here, you get a card from us saying, heads up, we meet here. If you want any more information, feel free to contact us. I think that's great. So just keep doing that and doing it more intently and intensely. And I think over time, maybe not our generation, we probably won't see the benefits of it, but we got to live off the borrowed capital of people who went before us. So we got to just be willing to not see the benefit ourselves. So those were my random thoughts that I've been kind of like just thinking in bits, and I definitely need to tighten it up to make it flow a little bit more and all that. But what do you think? Am I wrong?
I think that we all are sort of nostalgic. We think back to our childhood and Christmas. There's something very magical about that time, And even for me, who I didn't grow up in a Christian home, for whatever reason, there was some Christian elements that my grandmother kept in the house. So it would have been Christmas Carol book that I would read through, like, we don't talk about this all year, but it's interesting, it comes out this time of year. And you just kind of look back, and so when you get older, you do feel like in that, the Polar Express,
Yeah.
you do feel like somehow that's been lost. We've grown up, the magic is lost in the world. And I think we do look back at Christmas and we look for God to bring that sort of sense of awe and wonder back that we miss.
Classically, that's what Christians called for. They called to God and say, please bring us back. This is our rechecking it's a gut check once a year, exactly like that. And then, non-Christians too saw it, and maybe, they're made in God's image too, so they may have doubled down on trying harder. They'll be frustrated and realize they need the cross. But we'd rather have non-Christians trying to get along with each other rather than eating each other, like, was it Jeffrey Dahmer was he the guy who was eating his patients? We were just talking about him the other day. We were trying to remember if it was Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer.
It was Dahmer.
It was Dahmer, yeah, I think. So we'd rather non-Christians be a good version of a non-Christian, not Jeffrey Dahmer. But that's not going to get them to heaven. They're going to suffer eternity in hell without Christ. So the gospel is not just, it's first and foremost about the salvation of individuals, but Jesus said, go be yeast, be light, interact with things that are dark, that are not tasty. Be salt, rub it into that meat so you can preserve it and make it something worth or desirable. Those are not metaphors. He wasn't using those in context to preach the gospel. He was saying, go and be a Christian. Of course, and he said, and go preach the gospel. That was the first commandment.
Christmas gives you a chance to be, to give to other people, whereas any other time during the year, it's like, what do you want? Like, what are you up to now? We've got some neighbors, and they basically get out of the car and run in their house, and there's something. But at Christmas, you can really take some cookies over there, and it's not like weird.
Yeah.
You have a reason.
Unless they're immigrants from another country,
Yeah.
then you got a good excuse to share the gospel.
Yeah.
Here's why we do that, because that's maybe one reason why Christmas is diminished, is that our demographics have changed so much. But
You can be nice to people, and it's not considered weird.
right, and that helps,
Christmas,
right?
It helps.
Because maybe in January we'll continue it, but of course the day after Christmas, when you start returning gifts, you see that everyone's back to normal, as in retail and in college, and people are ugly the day after Christmas when they come. The same people who bought it from you the week before. But yes, I think that's important.
I think what your talk is reminding me of is just to be, and for me personally, to be more intentional about seeking out that stuff, the stuff that reminds us or brings us back, because I think there are so many opportunities around us. You know, you have, so many churches have programs or
Mhm.
Christmas Eve services, or, you know, to stop and take that time to bake with your kids, and just things that are, that you can do. But I think, like, for me, sometimes I feel overwhelmed in the holiday season. I mean, I try to be intentional about my quiet time and really focusing on the Lord. And one year when I homeschooled, my kids go to Metcalina, but one year I homeschooled them, and we did the whole month up to Christmas. We would pick songs or hymns, or we would read Christmas things like Point of Prophecy, and read leading up to that, because I had the flexibility in my schedule. But now I feel like I'm already thinking like, oh, what's on the Christmas list, and I gotta get the shopping done, and we're hosting like 3 parties, and so it becomes this. And so I will even look at my calendar and say, well, I don't have time for this, and I don't have time for this, because so this is making me think, like, you know, there are opportunities, and I have to be intentional about choosing what things to do and not to do, so that my focus and my family's focus can be on
Being
the right
intentional,
things.
that's the
Yeah.
key word, I think,
Yeah.
because it takes sitting down with our calendars, and then it takes leadership on our parts as parents, who still have young enough kids to say, this is what we've decided to do. So I have to have that talk, and I've already told them it's coming. All right, let's get out our calendars. You have to tell your employers, because both my son, primarily my daughters, you can't work on these days. We're gonna go to the Speedway and go through the lights and the nativity scene. We're gonna go out to, I asked my friends at work, because they're like from here, and I said, okay, from a local perspective, what's like you can't miss Christmas experiences around Charlotte, or a couple hour driving areas. And so we put all 4 of them, I put them all 4 down, and they said, which one of these you guys want to do? And they said, all 4 of them. I said, yeah, well, some of them are like really expensive. We're not doing that one, but we're going to do the Speedway, and we're going to do this other one. I can't remember the name of it now, but it looks really cool, actually. And so we're going to sit down, we're going to say, you can't do anything. I'll call your employer and say, I'm sorry, he failed to tell you, you know, that he couldn't work this night. That's how serious it's going to be. But they're excited about it, because we're a sentimental family, and you know, you can tell Brooke really gets into this stuff too. But yeah, intentionality is the
But it
key.
could even be like, if you don't wanna, you know, some things may cost money, but other things could be like, you know what, and we did like this last week, and this is not a Christmas thing, but we get so sidetracked, and then it comes the weekend, and we'll be like, well, what do you wanna do today? And well, the day's half over, right? So we had to go through our calendar last week and say, like, we're gonna put this on the calendar, whatever that family activity was,
Mhm.
even if it was just a family day, so that we didn't block anything else when we planned it. So,
Yeah.
in terms of Christmas, it could be, we're gonna watch a Christmas movie together and make hot cocoa and just, you know, read a scripture or something, just as
Yeah.
the intentionality, because I
Maybe a way
find,
to summarize
okay.
would be, so to add to number 2, or a new one, would be create your own traditions. Because I think it's important that we learn, those of us that still have young children, that we've got something to pass down that brings that magic of Christmas to them. And part of that is something traditional that they can count on every year.
Mhm.
Usually every year one of our kids will say, oh, you know, are we gonna do that again? And for whatever reason, doing whatever it is again seems really important, even though it's not a big deal.
Oh my gosh, we go to the Valentine gingerbread house thing, like,
We did that.
every single year.
We did that once, and they're all like, meh, I don't know why.
They're kind of getting there now, we're going through quicker and quicker, but they still
Every year
ask
they wanna
about
go
it.
to it, because we've been doing it for 10 years, and so and it really is, like, for the kids, I find, and some things are gonna be more spiritually minded, and
Mhm.
some aren't going to be, they're just fun. But for the kids, you know, Eric has been really good about teaching me the importance of, like.
Spending money.
Yeah,
The
he's great
importance
at
of it.
that, but creating the memories, creating those memories for our kids, so that, you know, what you said in one other point, that the kids want to be with you, they want to come home. I want my kids to grow up and think, you know, it's Christmas time, I kind of miss being,
Yeah.
you know, when they're married and have kids, I want to be home.
And they'll
with
want
my
to carry
kids.
on some of the traditions and then
Oh,
make some
yeah.
of their own. And what McAdenville's like that for us. It's free. You just drive, and if you're willing to walk around, and because driving is like, it takes forever, so we get out and walk around. And kids always ask, you know, hey, we ready to go to McAdenville? So.
Is that one of the 4?
No, these are 4. I was looking for ones that I hadn't done yet. I heard about Speedway, but
Heard about
never done it.
You haven't done it yet?
No.
What were the others?
Just so get there early, because we went one time.
That's
we
what I've
made the
heard.
mistake of going like an hour after like it started opening, and you're just stuck in hours of traffic. So you want to get there as early as possible to get ahead. You do the laps, you go to the middle, and you can enjoy all the stuff on the middle of the track walking around, and then you head out for another half hour of driving. So
Maybe we just got, because it opens at 6.
yes, get there at like 5 if you have to.
Put on your calendar that it opens at 4.
Yeah, that's what, Denton Farm, old steam engine. Actually, I found out that it's not. No, that one is the old steam engine. That sounds really cool, actually.
It is.
Is it cool?
I didn't go for Christmas, but they had like exhibitions of have things and people did like hot chocolate and stuff like that. And they make it for you.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like. A lot of old. There's an old homemade cookies, gingerbread house, homemade cookies, cocoa. Anyway.
And you can ride the train. They're like outdoor drive.
Yeah, that was the thing. I was looking for something like Polar Express, but then I found the real Polar Express that they do here.
Yeah.
It looks awesome. But it's $40 a person, so we're like, 5 people? No, I can do that. But it looks really cool. Like,
You ride the train, or you just go on an old classic train and get back off?
this one here, it says ride.
Okay. We're looking at it here on the internet, just.
Country
Couldn't tell if it
Christmas.
was just like you get on and see a show and you get off, or you actually, it moves.
Ride the handy dandy railroad through beautiful light displays.
Oh, that's interesting.
Then there's
I think-
Tanglewood and Winston-Salem, or outside Winston-Salem. You heard that?
That Dayton one, I think they have a passion play, one of those plays you drive through and they have a scene at each stop.
At the Denton Farm?
Yeah.
The one? That one's the one that we're definitely gonna do.
Tanglewood Park?
Tanglewood and Winston-Salem, I think, yeah, Tanglewood Park Festival of Lights is what they call it. But that, it's only $15 a vehicle, so that sounds fine, but then it says, very popular festival light. During these nights, long lines and wait times should be expected.
That's similar to the Lowe's Motor Speedway, right?
Well, this says weekends are especially busy and a 4-hour wait time should be expected.
Wow.
4 hours to wait to get in, then I guess where I'm not gonna go
Well,
on a
plus
weekend.
Hour and a half to get there.
Yeah, exactly. It's
Think
like-
of how many Hallmark movies you could watch in that time. Right.
See, if we had an RV, a small one, some people could sit in the back watching the Hallmark movies for 7 hours while we drive and wait. Or just show up the night before. So anyway, those are the 4 that they suggested. At least do one of them.